we turn to the 2,342nd meeting and tonight's lecture on validating research, steps for restoring trust in experimental results. It's my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Marcia McNutt. Marcia is the editor-in-chief of the journal Science and of Science Publications. Prior to becoming editor-in-chief of Science, Marcia was director of the U.S. Geological Survey, and before that, she served as president and CEO of the Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute. Marcia also was professor of marine geophysics at Stanford and professor of earth sciences and marine geophysics at UC Santa Cruz. She studied ocean island volcanism, continental breakup, and uplift of the Tibetan Plateau, participated in a number of major ocean expeditions, serving as chief scientist on many of them, and she made notable contributions to understanding the rheology and strength of the lithosphere, and she identified the South Pacific superswell. Among many other honors, Marcia was awarded the American Geological Union's McIlwain and Maurice Ewing medals and the U.S. Coast Guard's Meritorious Service Medal for her work to contain the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. She is a member of the National Academy of Sciences, the American Philosophical Society, and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and a fellow of the American Geophysical Union, the Geological Society of America, the International Association of Geodesy, and the AAAS. She earned a BA in physics from Colorado College and a PhD in earth sciences from the Scripps Institution of Oceanography at UC San Diego, which is my alma mater. And she also is the recipient of honorary doctoral degrees from Colorado College, the University of Minnesota, Monmouth University, and the Colorado School of Mines. And without more, please join me in welcoming Marcia to the podium. I need to switch this over.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Larry. That was an overly generous introduction. And thank you very much for this invitation to speak to you all tonight. I feel especially honored after hearing about the wonderful lecture last time and about the rich history of this gathering going back to nearly as far back as actually the founding of Science magazine. So it's quite a history. Okay, so Larry and I had quite a negotiation about what I was going to talk about tonight. I think we spent, I don't know how long it was on the phone, discussing various topics until we decided that the topic of validating research would be the right one, would be the right one for this group tonight in terms of fitting in with an after-dinner talk that would engage a broad cross-section of the scholarly community and appeal to those of you who are not only just in the research community as scientists, but also non-scientists alike. So let me start with just a little background. And let's think about how the scientific enterprise itself is changing. And there are a number of forces which are actually providing pressure on the scientific community. First of all, there's increased collaboration that's happening. And if we look at the time in just the last 20 years, the average number of authors on a paper has grown from an average of 3.2 to 5.6. So that's almost a doubling in the number of authors on a published paper. So what that means is that it's not just that more people are writing the paper, but it also means that the papers are becoming more complex in terms of the number of disciplines involved. It used to be that a paper, if it only had 2 or 3 authors on it, they might all be physicists, or they might all be geologists. Now they're biologists and geologists and chemists all together on the paper. So they're more interdisciplinary. There's also increased competition. Many NIH and NSF programs report success levels below 20% in an individual competition. 20 years ago, 30 years ago, it would be typical that there would be 30 to 35% success levels, and those success levels have now been cut in half in terms of, in an individual competition, your chance of getting funded. There's also increased globalization. The share of U.S. research papers with a foreign co-author grew from 8% in 1988 to 24% in 2010. So in about 3 decades, a factor of 3 increase in the number of papers that have foreign co-authors. So we're becoming more international in our scientific enterprise. Next, scale. 1 million papers were published in 2014. And if you look at the graph in the increase of number of papers published, it's looking like Moore's Law. That's kind of scary. Moore's Law in numbers of papers. How do you keep up with it? How do you assure quality control with that boom in publishing? And finally, there's increased societal impact in terms of the importance of all of that research to our health, to our economy, to our environment, and to our quality of life. So people are actually caring about the work that we do. It's not just of academic interest anymore. So what does this all mean? This puts pressure on researchers. So for example, as the number of researchers and authors has grown on each paper, how are you, as an individual author, able to trust the work of all your collaborators, especially those with different expertise? Do you know when you have 5 other co-authors on your paper that you can verify that the work they have done on your collaborative work is all trustworthy, high quality, and free of fraud? When they're maybe biologists and you're a geologist, how do you do that? Secondly, with success rates in the teens for submitting to an individual competition at NIH, NSF, or somewhere else, how can you make your research stand out from the crowd in order to obtain the next grant? And what are the pressures on you to perhaps inflate the importance of your research, or to perhaps cut corners in order to make your research look a little better in order to stand out so that you'll get that next grant? There are pressures that you might put on yourself or that others might put on you. And with globalization, will the co-authors from different cultures conform to different standards of conduct? If you've got a co-author from another country, how do you know that they agree with you on what's a conflict of interest or what is unethical to do in writing and publishing a paper? And how can we possibly maintain quality in an overtaxed peer review system when we're publishing on a Moore's Law curve, okay? And finally, can the public still trust science with all of these new pressures on the research enterprise? So I would say that all of these factors together are contributing to a research system that is under stress like we've never seen before. It has gone from a more polite, collegial situation to an extremely competitive, cutthroat, high-pressure situation where students are in intense competition for jobs, for publications in the top journals, and for research grants. So the question I ask here is, we see these pressures playing out in the published literature, in what are ways that are not good for science. It's irreproducible results, reports of conflict of interest, retractions, and questions from the public as to whether they can trust science. So, what are we going to do about it, is the question. How can we counteract some of those pressures and restore the public's trust in science, given these trends? So let me tell you a few stories. Let's start with this one, Wakefield. All right, how many people are familiar with Andrew Wakefield? Okay, I see a bunch of hands going up. Okay, so Andrew Wakefield was a British MD, and he was working at the Royal Free Hospital in London. He and his co-authors here, you see many of them on this paper, published a paper in 1998, so not that long ago, and it was published in a very top medical journal, The Lancet. Very well known, very highly regarded. Now, what this paper purported to show was that with only 12 patients, 12 subjects in this study, 12 children, that they developed autism after having been given the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine. Okay, so immediately there was kind of a red flag about this paper, because in the very same issue of The Lancet, a critique of the paper was published simultaneously with the original paper, indicating that the Lancet editors themselves had some qualms about the validity of this paper. The reviewers had raised some concerns about the sample size, about the protocols that were done in the study, and there were red flags. However, as soon as this paper came out, Wakefield's own institution, the Royal Free Hospital, held major press conferences touting this result about the concerns of the mumps, measles, rubella vaccine. And Wakefield stood up and said, he wasn't talking about this as a scientific finding with all of its caveats. He said, quote, "This is a moral issue." A moral issue about vaccination of children. His own co-authors, who were drowned out by this "it's a moral issue," said the worst thing that could happen from the publication of this paper would be that parents stopped vaccinating their children, because they said that thousands of more children would die from a measles epidemic than would ever be harmed from the handful of potential cases from autism. But yet, they were drowned out by Wakefield, "it's a moral issue." There were attempts to replicate Wakefield's findings. They all failed. There was a measles outbreak in 2002, just as the co-authors had predicted, because parents stopped vaccinating their children. And what happened that was also contributing to this was that the leadership in London, the Prime Minister, when asked, "Do you trust the vaccines?" had no comment. He didn't stand up and say, "Yes, I am vaccinating my children. I trust the scientific establishment and that it's safe. So finally, the investigative reporters dug out, but not until 2004, so this was 6 years later, dug out the fact that Wakefield had been funded by attorneys acting on behalf of a family whose child had developed autism to undertake this study in the first place. That he was being paid by attorneys to find a link between autism and something, anything, so that the parents could get money from someone with deep pockets. And once they uncovered that, then finally the Lancet started moving, but it took until 2010, so 12 years later, for the paper to be retracted. So, if we look at what went right, here's Wakefield. The peer review, in this case, Lancet's own peer review detected the weaknesses in the original study design and analysis. Peer review did its job, but they published the paper anyway. The investigative journalists uncovered Wakefield's conflict of interest eventually, but not until they started looking. And Wakefield was sanctioned and thoroughly disgraced by the professional community. He lost his license, his MD license, and was no longer allowed to practice medicine. And so he is now disgraced in England quite thoroughly. But if we look at what went wrong, there's so much more that went wrong in this case. First of all, the journal lacked declarations for conflict of interest of authors, though whether Wakefield would have declared it is another question. The institution, in this case, the Royal Free Hospital in London, sensationalized the study results and made a bigger deal of it than the science would have actually allowed. Politicians failed to set a good example. It took 12 years until the retraction, and actually Wakefield, after he lost his license in the UK, moved to Texas, where he is now a folk hero. He goes around and gives lectures at local churches in Texas. People love him. These are some of his supporters. Listen to Andrew Wakefield. And they protect him, and they adore him, and they fund him. And he writes books. He writes books about his research. So if you think that Wakefield, by being disgraced by the scientific community, has been silenced, it has not happened. It has not happened. Okay, so let's go to another example. Does anyone not know who this young lady is? Okay, so this young lady is Hakoru Obokata, and for a brief period of time, Hakoru Obokata was the darling of the media. She was on talk shows, she was on the front page of magazines, she was on newspapers, people were flashing cameras in her face at every moment because she was everyone's example of the young female scientist who had managed to persevere and make it to the top in the male-dominated Japanese system. And what she had done was discovered, against all odds, a very simple method to make pluripotent stem cells by simply bathing adult stem cells in an acid bath. And they would revert to pluripotent stage such that the cells could be turned, if it was just an adult cell, by reverting it to a pluripotent stage, it could be reprogrammed to be a nerve cell or a heart cell or a muscle cell. And this would be wonderful because even an adult like me, you could take one of my cells, make it a pluripotent stem cell, and I could grow a new liver for me. Or I could grow my own new kidney or something like that. I wouldn't need to have donor body parts. We could grow my own. It would be wonderful, and I'd be a perfect match to me. This would be fabulous. So for a moment, she was on top of the world, until it was found that everything she had done was falsified. So, here she is, not long later, when she is tearfully admitting to the press that she had to retract her paper and that she had falsified the results. Well, it took her a long time to admit that things had been falsified. But what went right in this case, this is one of these examples where, in terms of retracting a paper, you couldn't ask for a more classic example of things being done right. The paper was published in Nature, and within days of that paper being published, on a website called PubPeer, people started posting questions about the reliability of this paper. And they said, this doesn't seem right. And one after another, people were pointing out different things in this study that they thought were wrong. And someone, the most telling, was that someone pointed out that there were figures in the paper published in Nature that were duplicates of her thesis, except the figures in her thesis were supposed to be cells from something else. And yet these were supposed to be these pluripotent stem cells that had been made from this simple acid bath, but yet they were taken from her thesis. So that was the first sort of smoking gun that there was something wrong. And then no one could duplicate the this simple acid bath treatment. And then when people went to her co-authors and asked her co-authors, who were the creme de la creme in this field of science, who, by the way, many of them had also gone on talk shows and personally taken a lot of credit for this work. When they asked them, by the way, did you personally duplicate this work before you went to press? No. None of them had duplicated the work, and suddenly all of them were backpedaling, and none of them could take responsibility for anything that had been published. So the community quickly uncovered the problems. The co-authors quickly backed off from having any faith in the work. There was a swift investigation by her research institution. And I have to say, her research institution did everything right. They stepped in immediately. They did a quick investigation. And they found all of the problems. They found that the cells that she had said were caused by this acid bath were actually not caused that way, that actually had been done the tried and true genetic way, not through the acid bath, etc. They had did everything the right way, and then there was a prompt retraction by the journal Nature. So this is the scientific method working the way it should. So what went wrong in this? Well, peer review failed at Nature. It clearly failed to question a paper that was simply too good to be true. You might also say that some of there have been to date no investigations at the other institutions also responsible for oversight. The institutions where her co-authors worked, none of them have done an investigation as to whether there should have been better oversight or whatever. So you sort of get the feeling that her co-authors bore no responsibility for any of this. There was failure of some institutional communications to emphasize that the system basically worked. As I say, I think this is a good example of how a problem was found out right away and the retraction was swift. I think that too much of the communication around this was, oh, this is really bad for science, but I think it really showed science at its best, finding a problem and swiftly dealing with it. And of course, one bad thing is that one of the co-authors, this was her immediate supervisor at Riken, not where the work had been done. The work had actually been done while she was in the US, before she went back to Riken. But this was her immediate supervisor at Riken who had been identified in the investigation at Riken as someone who should have reproduced the work before it went to publication, and very promising young researcher at Riken with a very promising future, and he committed suicide, which was extremely sad. Okay, so these are two examples. One thing I have to say is that these are rare examples where there's actual fraud, which happened in both of these cases. One case because of clear conflict of interest, the other case pressure on this young woman. Let me just skip ahead on these two because I really want to talk about that fraud is really exceptionally rare, that we don't see that all very often, and that replication, and let me go back to say what replication is. In the spectrum of reproducibility, we have two end members. One end member is replication, where the study is repeated start to finish, including new data collection and analysis using fresh materials and reagents. That's what was needed in, for example, the stem cell case. Repeatability is simply taking the same data and reanalyzing it using the same methodology. This is the gold standard for reproducibility, and that's what's needed in the lab sciences. I'm going to talk a little bit later on about repeatability because sometimes repeatability is all we can actually hope for in some kinds of science. Like, I'm a geoscientist. And for a geoscientist, replication has no meaning. And an example is the Tohoku earthquake off Japan. If one group goes out and studies that earthquake, I'm not going to repeat the earthquake start to finish. That has no meaning. All I can do is hope to get their data and repeat the analysis using perhaps my own methods, but I have to use the same data because there's no way that there'll ever be the same earthquake exactly in the same place and exactly happening in the same way. The same's true of a lot of field studies. If an ecologist goes out in the forest and does a study, and another ecologist wants to recreate that study, the forest has changed. Time is linear. Time goes forward. You can never back up time and do the same study again. Things have always changed. So in that case, what I'm saying here is that for some fields of investigation, like lab studies, we can do replication. In other studies, repeatability is the only thing we can hope to get. Okay, so as I say, fraud's exceptionally rare. Replication is going to uncover true fraud, and many times it's a whistleblower that's going to reveal fraud. But at least in the fraud cases that I showed you, most agree on the best path forward. It's a retraction, sanctions against the person who did it, and discrediting the investigator. And that's what happened in the case of Wakefield, and that's what happened in the case of Obukata. She will probably never work in science again. So let's talk about the case, though, of where there's lack of replication, but it's not the case of fraud. That's the vast number of cases, and what are we going to do about that? So let's talk about reasons for lack of replicability. One reason is sometimes information is withheld. Someone does an experiment, they publish the experiment, but they don't tell you everything they did for various reasons. Maybe there was not enough space. They had to fit it into, just 4 pages, so they didn't have enough space. Or they didn't deem some details important for whatever reason. Or sometimes it's tacit knowledge that the practitioner doesn't even know he or she possesses, that there's a certain way they do something that they don't even realize when they're doing it, that they're doing it, and so they don't know to tell you it. It's sort of like, your mother has a great way of making chocolate cake that unless you actually watch her doing it, you don't realize, oh, that's the way you, sift the flour or something. I never even thought about that. Or the system is not sufficiently known. Not all independent variables are controlled. This is starting to become a hugely recognized problem. And then there's also the problem of false positive or negatives, which is a statistical problem that is also being recognized as a major problem. So let's talk about the problem of where we don't understand everything that other groups are doing. You all probably remember the case of the airplane that went into the Hudson, and Schellenberger, who was the pilot, who became the hero after the plane went down because there was a double bird strike that were ingested into the engines. And he described how he smelled burning birds as both engines shut down and it went in. So here's how the story goes. Now, I'll tell you in the end, just to give you the punchline, I was very disappointed to hear that this story isn't true. But it's a great story, so I'll tell it to you anyway. So the way the story went was after this plane crash, the FAA put a lot of resources into trying to understand bird strikes. And so, and that part's true. So they wanted to understand bird strikes. So they were doing a lot of lab tests of what are the conditions under which jets go down with bird strikes, what kind of size birds and how many birds and that sort of thing. So the way the story goes is the Japanese were doing the same as well because so many flights go through the Northern Flyway between Japan and the US. So the US FAA and the Japanese equivalent were not getting the same answers in terms of the numbers and sizes of birds that it was taking to shut these jet engines down. And so they were comparing their notes and saying, well, why aren't we getting the same answer? So finally, the US researchers decided, well, we're just going to go over to Japan and find out how they're doing their experiments to find out why we're not agreeing. So they went over to Japan, and they had both agreed that they were going to be using turkeys as their canonical bird. And when they get over to Japan, they find out that whereas the US is using thawed turkeys, Japan was using frozen turkeys. Okay, now finally, if someone told me that this story is apocryphal and that it actually didn't happen that way. But it makes a great story anyway to illustrate the fact that sometimes you think you know everything about what someone else is doing, and there's just this little detail about thawed versus frozen turkeys that, of course, would make a huge difference in terms of how the jet engine would respond to throwing the bird into the engine. So that's my example for that. Okay, now the other thing I mentioned was not all independent variables have been identified as such. Well, there was a recent paper in Nature that demonstrated that the smell of a man makes mice more stressed than the smell of a woman. And the way that this was discovered was that that for many mammals, they suppress a pain reaction when around men that they don't suppress when around women. So that they're more relaxed around women, and so they're more likely to show if they're in pain. And when they're around men, they're more guarded, so they suppress that pain reaction. And, for a lot of people like me, I'm a huge animal lover, I know this because I have lots of animals, and I notice that they are much more relaxed around women than men for whatever reason. Now, there have been literally decades of laboratory measurements done on mice in labs on what levels of anesthesia are needed in order to suppress pain when they are being used for experiments, in which no one ever bothered to record whether it was a man or a woman administering the medication. So all of that data has to be thrown out because no one knows who administered the dose. Okay, so or it would be a good example of two different labs getting two different results, and it could be because one came from male technicians and one came from female technicians, and that would be a source of differences in the reproducibility. So another example that I also think is very widespread in science, in addition to having independent variables that haven't been defined as such, is the problem of bias. And this is something that we're constantly fighting in our authors and in our reviewers with both false positives and false negatives. And false positives are the ones that are perhaps more insidious when we are looking at papers to publish, because particularly for a journal like Science, we're interested in novel, exciting results. And let's suppose people are doing, let's suppose we've got 200 different researchers out there, and they just happen to be doing the same experiment. Just doing it the same way. And let's suppose in every single case, that experiment they're doing has no chance in nature of actually finding a positive result, because in nature it's wrong. That actually doesn't happen. Out of 200 people trying it, statistically, the chances of there being a false positive is actually very good, if depending on how many samples people are running. So there will probably be one of those 200 researchers who will send a paper into Science saying, I've got a statistically significant result of a positive outcome for this, and this is the paper to publish in Science, and unless we happen to send it to one of those other 200 people who said, wait, I already ran this experiment and I got a negative, and we call this the file drawer effect, is people don't send us the negative results, and so we don't see the negative outcomes. And so what's happening now is this growing movement in the scientific community that we need more ways to find out about the negative outcomes as well as the positive ones, so we know statistically when something's a false positive, so we can compare it to it because we've seen all the negative ones as well, and we don't pick out that false positive. Okay, and now, so those are all things that are somewhat, you can put your finger on the problem, independent variables we didn't know about, and tacit knowledge we didn't know about, and bias. But now, mistakes. Mistakes also happen. Someone just has a blunder in the lab, and they got this crazy, wonderful result, and they're really excited about it. And you know something? If you make a mistake and get an awful result and you hate it, you're more likely to run the experiment again and say, oh, whoa, I made a mistake last time. But if you make a mistake and get a crazy, wonderful result, you're probably not going to go run it again. You're probably going to send it to Science. Okay, so that's the problem here. Repeating analysis can uncover the weakness in the reported result, but repeating the analysis is probably only going to be done by someone else after it's already been published. But that's where the culture of science can actually work to our advantage. And that's what we try to tell the public, is the wonderful thing about the culture of science is that no one gets kudos in science by showing that someone else was right. You only get kudos in science by showing that someone else was wrong. And so, let's face it, that's what we're all here for, is to, make science go forward by showing something new, not by confirming something old. So, if you see something published that you don't like because, it's not setting right with you, you're probably going to try to reproduce it. And it's to your advantage to show that it's wrong, because then you can move forward by showing that work was not reproducible. So that's where the culture of science is working to our advantage. But the problem here is, although the culture works to our advantage, the problem is that, has anyone ever submitted a proposal to get funding to reproduce something that's already been published? That is really, really tough. Now, we've been working with a few private foundations who are really interested in replication, and they are now starting to fund some replication studies. Sloan Foundation, the Arnold Foundation, NIH is starting to fund some replication studies, and what they're doing is picking some ones that are really important, not everything, but a few that are really important, some that are really key because they are viewed as foundation to move the field forward, and saying these are important enough that we should replicate them, and so they're funding them, and that's good. And the other cultural problem we have here is that authors, institutions, and funders have an aversion to retractions for honest mistakes. And so here's one thing that we're toying with at Science, and I'd love to hear reactions during the Q&A from you here. We're thinking we need two categories here. Retraction might be fine for the Wakefields of the world, where someone really did something pretty awful. But we need maybe another term for someone who just made a mistake. There are a lot of papers that we retract in Science where it's actually the author who calls me up and says, by the way, we just looked back at this paper we did, and we found that our correction for the data from the telescope used the complete wrong filter. And all of our plots are wrong, and we're going to have to redo this analysis. We would like to withdraw this, we would like to retract the paper from Science. We no longer have confidence in it. We know it's wrong. It has to be removed from the literature. And we say, yeah, fine, we'll do that, no problem, we'll do that for you. But it's almost not fair to the author to have that in the same bucket as the Wakefield paper. And so I almost think we need another term, withdrawn by author for that, and retraction for someone like Wakefield. So that's just my thought on that. Okay, so I think we need the right incentives here to encourage PIs to check the results of others, to encourage technical comments to correct the results, and reward PIs who consistently produce high-quality results. Let me just get quickly to some of the things we're doing at Science. I think there's a role for funding agencies, particularly to alert panels to the criteria for reproducibility, and as I said, they are now reproducing key experiments. And for journals, I'm going to tell you a little bit about some of the new standards we're putting into place. And so let me just quickly go to that. So here's what Science is doing. We've announced a set of new initiatives to increase reader and reviewer confidence in the studies we've published. For example, we've added additional members to our board of reviewing editors from the statistics community with the help of the American Statistical Association, and that's to get around this thing of false positives, to do a better job of the statistics with which our studies are subjected to. We also held a workshop in the preclinical sciences that was joint with Nature and NIH that resulted in a document that provided new standards in the preclinical arena. And this document was signed on to by 75 editors-in-chief that represent 120 journals, and the list is continuing to grow. And these journals are now asking all their authors, when they submit a paper, to declare whether they have actually followed these guidelines in order to show reviewers and the readers that their studies, to increase the confidence in the results of their work. And there are things like randomization in their sample treatment, blind conduct of their experiment, whether they had appropriate signal to noise in their sample size, et cetera. We had a second workshop that was funded by the Arnold Foundation and was jointly supported by the Berkeley Initiative for Transparency in the Social Sciences, and that resulted in a wonderful document in which we're going to be asking journals to sign on to declare one of 3 tiers for reproducibility, and the 3 tiers are in various areas, things like data availability, whether they've got a data analysis plan, things like whether they had a plan before they started their research, that was a registered plan, et cetera. And the 3 tiers, the first tier is just the lowest tier where they would ask authors to declare what they did. So it's just a transparency in what they did. The second tier would be to ask authors to conform to a community standard, which would uniformly raise the bar in what the community is, how the community is doing their research. And the third tier, which we expect few people to actually aspire to, would be that the journals or some other independent group would actually verify that that standard was followed. So for example, in data, if this is being applied to data, it would ask the authors, did you make your data available? The second tier would be, the journals would say, to publish here, you must make your data available to everyone. And the third tier would be to say that the journal actually verifies that the data is publicly available in a public data repository. Now, getting to the end here, role of universities. Universities are responsible for training future and current researchers in the scientific method and in best practices. They can reward researchers who produce reproducible results and withhold rewards from researchers who produce non-reproducible research. In general, if I had to say what's the one thing I would like to see universities do, would be when we uncover an example of scientific misconduct, I would love to see universities quickly, swiftly, and transparently investigate. And you'd be surprised at how many universities in the US and overseas drag their feet because they're worried about the publicity that comes to their university if a misconduct case is found. And the more senior and esteemed the author, the more the foot dragging. And that's not good for science. I think scientific societies have a role in this too. They could consider honoring those who consistently produce reproducible research, have special sessions on best practices in reproducibility, and adopt reproducibility guidelines for their publications. And this needs to be a team effort. So just in closing, I've heard it said that scientific journals use leverage to promote reproducible research from the scientific community, and that it's the job of the journals to make it, the science, reproducible. But in my experience, the better analogy for the relationship is that of a well-choreographed pair of dancing partners where the journals and the community work together hand in hand to make this happen. So with that, I'd be happy to take questions.
Thank you, Marcia. We have time for questions, as you noted. We have a procedure here, so there are a couple of microphones that are held by a couple of volunteers. So please raise your hand and keep it up so they can see that you want to ask a question. Okay. And when they bring the microphone to you, please stand up, tell us your name, tell us whether you're a member of the society or a guest. There's no penalty for not being a member of the society, but you'll be bombarded by people asking you to join.
Okay. I'm a new member.
Yes.
My name is Marcia McNutt. Go back 4 slides.
Yes.
And I thought it was interesting. I didn't like something that was up there. And then one more.
This one?
Okay. Can reward researchers who produce results and withhold rewards? You know, I think if you told the community that they could only get a reward for something, in other words, how do you know you're going to be successful until you get to the end? And that's what research is about. I think that somebody puts in a lot of time and the research fails. They shouldn't exactly be.
Yeah, no, I don't think this is meant to be a result. It's perfectly fine for experiments to fail. What this is meant to say instead is that, let me give an example of my community, which is oceanography. In oceanography, we all know whose measurements we trust. And whose measurements, if someone has gone out and said, the iron in this part of the ocean is so many parts per liter, and it comes from that lab, it's gold. If it comes from that lab, well, we'll wait till someone else verifies it. Because we know that certain people give really great measurements that are totally reproducible, and you can take it to the bank. Whereas other people are a little bit sloppier, they aren't so careful, they don't run a lot of blanks to constantly calibrate their machines, they don't train their students in really careful measurements, that sort of thing. So all I'm saying is that universities are very good about rewarding researchers for scientific findings at the end, but there's an intermediate step along the way about people that produce just really good data that you can trust. And so what I'm saying here is I think that universities should also be thinking about rewarding people for producing just really good results that can be trusted, as well as further down the line, did you take that really good stuff that you can trust and then did something else come of it? I think it's perfectly understood that in the scientific process there will be some experiments that fail and some experiments that succeed, and no one wants to ever punish someone for trying an experiment and having it fail. I've had lots of experiments that fail. That's fine. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Claire. I am new, first time visiting today. It was a great talk, and I wanted to ask a quick question. You mentioned that very few of the reproducibility problem comes from fraud. And I agree, as long as fraud is defined as making up data. But as a new scientist, I was actually somewhat appalled to find out the level of things that are not considered fraud. So you mentioned, for example, with the false positive problem, that you might have tons of labs doing this experiment over and over and over again, and only the one that finds it publishes it. But in my experience, all of those experiments are often done in the same lab, and they'll keep repeating it and then only publish the last one. Shouldn't that be considered misconduct or fraud?
Okay.
Isn't that a problem? Maybe we're not.
Okay, I am so glad that you brought up that point. So in these new guidelines, there it is, that came out of this workshop, one of the requirements here in terms of the analysis part of it is that, I forget which category it fell under, but basically you have to be transparent about if there were any data that were collected in the process of your experimental plan that were not used in your analysis, you have to include that data in your paper and explain why it was not used. Okay? So everyone understands that there may be a reason why the data were not used, but you have to put the data in the paper and you have to explain why. And it was for exactly that reason. You can't cherry pick. That's called cherry picking your data, and that is dishonest. Yes.
Kristen Ferry, and I am a member of the Society. I really appreciate this talk, and one aspect in particular, an encouragement for publishing negative results. My question, however, has to do with conflict of interest and dishonesty during the reviewing process. One of the most spectacular examples a few years ago was some emails released from an English university where they had conspired to suppress papers that had a story other than the global warming story that they were promoting to get grant funding. And the grant situation, particularly with extramural reviews, there's a lot of difficulties with who's on the panel, who's reviewing your papers, and do they have conflicts? What is going on to help address that?
Okay. Okay, that's a great question. So we had a discussion about that at a very small workshop I attended, and we've decided that this blanket term, conflict of interest, is way too confusing for people. That we needed to expand this term to ask both reviewers and authors, and we're vetting this through something called the Committee on Publishing Ethics, to see how they feel about it, because then we could propagate it for more journals. As to whether the question should be, do you have any, the way it's, I'm going to have to remember what the exact wording is, but do you have any affiliations or positions that would constitute or appear to constitute a bias, but basically it's asking people to declare whether either through something that has to do with how they are paid, where they are employed, what sort of positions they've taken or whatever. Anyone could either view that as materially or appear to be in giving a bias in terms of their either authorship on the paper or their review of it. And we feel that by asking the question in that way, we're going to get a much more complete response from the person. And we don't necessarily expect that to mean that someone has to remove themselves from either being an author or a reviewer. But for authors, we need to publish that with the paper so that the readers can read that and see what that might be, and so they take the paper with that caveat in mind. And for reviewers, so the editors can decide, do I want a review from this person or not?
My name is James Griffin. I'm a member. In my lifetime in science, I've noticed repeatedly with regret a characteristic of science that is not shared by other activities in American society. In the arts, in music, in politics, there are people who do it and there are people who observe it. In science, as far as I can tell, you cannot make a living by observing science with serious intellectual criticism. You can make a living by adulating it, by putting it on TV, by making movies out of it, but if you want to sit down and read the literature and criticize it with intelligence, I came to this because a long ago acquaintance I made with Charlie Gable at the University of Wisconsin. Charlie Gable did not perform miracles in research, but he had the reputation for years and years at the University of Wisconsin to be the go-to guy. Whoever you were, top drawer theorist, experimentalist, you went to Charlie Gable and talked to him and he said, hey, you know, there's a paper back there 20 years ago that you really ought to go read. And I met many, many colleagues, mutual acquaintances with him. if there were a candidate for this job, the one case I have is Charlie Gable, but in my whole lifetime, I've never seen anybody who, if he had
Is there a
this-
question here?
The question is, why does science not cultivate a group of critics, serious critics, who make a living at it, and who don't do science, but who study science and criticize it objectively? That's my question.
I thought that's what all scientists are supposed to do.
Yeah, I think that the science is a very introspective, self-criticizing profession. We are constantly criticizing ourselves in the way I don't see as much being done in, for example, my next door neighbor is a very famous artist. And I don't see her spending anywhere near as much time, in fact, no time do I see her spending criticizing artists as much time as I spend criticizing scientists.
There is a New York review.
Let's go to questions, okay? You can have the conversation afterwards, there'll be time, but let's go to the next question.
My name is Scott Matthews, and I am a member. First, I object to your characterization of a researcher who finds some very interesting result in a laboratory experiment and rushes to publish it before reproducing it. Over the past 10 years, I've been associated with 3 specific experimental results, one which we were not able to reproduce, and therefore we never published it.
Yay.
Scott, do you have a question? Or is this a
Yes. So
statement?
my question is,
Good for you.
I think that if you are really interested in publishing exciting and transformational science, science that really has the potential to change a paradigm, by definition, that science is working with systems that are unknown and poorly characterized. And therefore, knowing what all the hidden variables are in truly new, novel
Right.
science is
Yes.
impossible.
Right.
And this makes reproducibility much more difficult for real science. Does that present an obstacle? Is setting reproducibility as the bar that needs to be cleared, is that creating an obstacle for truly transformational science?
Okay, that is really an excellent question. First of all, let me say this. Just because a result is not reproducible doesn't make it wrong. And just because a result is reproducible doesn't make it right. So we should not hold reproducibility as the only standard by which we judge science. And I can give you lots of examples of science that was reproduced by many groups and then shown to be absolutely wrong. And I can also tell you about science that was shown to be absolutely unreproducible by another group, and yet was still right. So there's that. I would say that some of the very most interesting papers are, as you describe, where a researcher or a research group is looking at maybe something new, something complex. They might be using a lot of intuition. They may be trying to resolve something that is just at the hairy edge of being able to do it because they're using technology that is working at its very limit, and there's not yet next generation that's going to actually nail it down. And so you might say, well, gosh, do they just have to sit on the results and wait for 10 years for something better to come along? Absolutely not. And in fact, my attitude about papers like that in science are that as long as the author is absolutely honest about it, that is fine. And what we spend most of our time doing is simply toning down authors' rhetoric. about saying to the author, let's be clear about all the caveats on this, that this isn't, the be-all, end-all, that this may be a paper that is the first word on something and that is going to inspire a next generation of experiments. But that's what you love to have, is a paper that other people are going to read and say, whoa, that's kind of cool. I would like to see where that leads, or I would like to, try to confirm that, maybe using some entirely other different method. Because I think the best way to show something is right is not to reproduce it using the same technique, but to come at it from 180 degrees. Come at it from a completely different way and show, if it was done with a biochemistry, show it with genetics, something like that. That's the way you really show something's right.
I have two more questions.
I have one in the back.
One in the back, and then this one up here, and then...
Oh, I'm going to be different. I'm going to state the question first, then do the commentary.
Could you skip the comment part?
Going back to a follow-up question, essentially, the business of PAL review. As a graduate student, it was much to my surprise that I found out that paper submissions were not double-blind. My advisor told me it didn't matter because they would figure out who you are anyway, which struck me as something of an appalling situation. And on the inverse side, there's what if my enemies get my submission? And again, the joke. They would ask you in the submission, well, who would you not like to review this? And another cynical advisor of mine would laugh and say, leave it blank because whoever you say not to submit it to, that's who they're going to give it to.
Question?
So, yeah, the question is there is there a genuine way to stop PAL review? Because I don't see it.
Is there a genuine way to do what?
Stop what I call PAL review,
Oh.
where a person
PAL.
pretty much knows who's going to review their paper, and they know that they're their buddy, and they know they're going to take it and they're going to publish it. Because that happens very often.
It does, yeah. Okay, so first of all, in terms of double-blind reviews, many of you may have heard Nature has just started an experiment with double-blind reviews. And you can opt in. It's not going to be their default, but you can opt in for it. So for people interested in double-blind reviews, all of us will be really interested to see how that works and whether it's successful with them, because I think it'll be kind of interesting to watch what happens with that. In terms of PAL reviews, of course, the very worst example of that was recently with a journal, I think it was in Material Science, where the editor was fired, and I think the journal was in deep trouble. 60 papers were withdrawn when it was found out that what was happening was the journal allowed authors, when they submit their papers, they could not only list who they didn't want to review it, but they could list who they wanted to review it. So people were, of course, putting their pals, but an enterprising group of authors went a step further, and they started making up email addresses that were pseudonyms for themselves. And so the papers from this journal, and the journal just automatically sent it to the list on the author's preferred reviewer list without checking to see if these people actually existed. And so these authors were reviewing their own papers and, of course, giving themselves glowing reviews. And so, as I say, this journal had to retract 60 papers because of this.
This whole thing is really shocking to me. I mean, it's totally shocking. As a graduate student, I wasn't allowed to publish anything I had to reproduce 3 times. And I had to review a paper submitted by my advisor, and I rejected it.
Yeah. Now, I have to say there are some labs that are great. I was talking to Steve Chu, and he said in his lab, the new students coming in have to reproduce the experiments of the students who are graduating. And you can imagine what a great training that is for the students, because they know when they graduate that the next student coming in is going to reproduce their work, so they better do a really good job.
Last question.
So my question is,
Whoa,
Sorry.
we're going to hear it.
so my question is whether there are any efforts through either these research standards that you're talking about or other community standards to make the employing organizations, the universities you said, who are often dragging their feet in terms of investigating their own researchers, more responsible for not catching them in the first instance. We do this in a lot of other contexts, with employers being responsible for the misconduct of their employees, so they'll take steps that are reasonable to prevent them from making them in the first instance. I'm wondering if there are any efforts in that regard to apply those sort of norms, either legally or, I would imagine, more like through social norms in the scientific
Yeah.
community.
Okay. Yeah, that's a really good question. So we've been talking with people at the National Academy of Sciences about working through the AAU, the American Association of Universities, as a potential route to changing the cultures at universities. The problem with that is not all universities are members of AAU, and that only deals with US. It doesn't get us anything overseas. So, the problem is university or journals just don't have a lot of leverage on that. So, if anyone has any ideas, I would love to hear them.
So that was the last question, but there is a 1-hour social hour following the closing remarks, during which time you will be able to talk to Marcia, and I don't think you'll be restricted to asking a question. So if you'll bear with me, there are a few things to do before we adjourn to the social hour, and the first one of them is to present Marcia with a plaque signed by members of the General Committee. It's the announcement of her talk, and we appreciate your talk very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for coming and standing with us. It's great.
All right, thank you.
So